Welcome to the Marketing Behind Rapid Growth, the podcast where we explore the strategies, decisions, and growth engines behind some of the world's most successful technology companies. Today we're talking about Anthropic. Picture a backyard in California sometime in early 2021. There's a tent set up against the rain, a handful of investors seated inside it, and a small group of researchers about to pitch something unusual. Not a faster AI, not a flashier one. A company built from its founding documents onward around the idea that the industry racing toward artificial intelligence was moving too quickly and too carelessly for its own good. The people making that pitch had just walked away from OpenAI, the most talked about AI lab on the planet. Dario and Daniela Amodei didn't leave because they doubted the technology. They left because they doubted the pace. And in an industry where speed is usually treated as the only currency that matters, that single decision became the seed of one of the most disciplined growth stories in recent technology history. This is the story of how a company that refused to move fast ended up growing faster than almost anyone expected, and how the thing it refused to do became, in the end, the whole strategy. Let's start with the moment that made Anthropic's bet possible in the first place. When ChatGPT launched in late 2022, it didn't just introduce the public to generative AI, it triggered a stampede. Labs across the industry began racing each other toward the same finish line. Bigger models, faster releases, flashier demos, all optimized for headlines and leaderboard rankings. But inside large companies, that same speed was producing something closer to dread than excitement. Executives wanted the productivity gains everyone was talking about. Their legal and procurement teams wanted none of the risk that came with them. Proprietary data leaking into a public training set. A model confidently inventing facts in a client-facing document. An autonomous agent taking an action nobody approved and nobody can explain. Procurement officers and general counsel became the real decision makers in enterprise AI adoption, and they were anxious. That anxiety was, in effect, a market opportunity sitting in plain sight. While most of the industry fought over consumer attention, almost nobody was building specifically for the cautious professional. Anthropic's founding insight was that inside the enterprise, trust isn't a feature. Trust is the product-market fit itself. Whoever could lower that anxiety would unlock the kind of durable, recurring revenue that consumer hype cycles rarely produce. So how do you sell trust to a buyer who has been burned, or expects to be? You don't put it on a landing page. You build it into the product so deeply that the buyer experiences it before they ever read a word of marketing copy. That's effectively what Anthropic did with Claude. The company understood early that you cannot simply attach a secure badge to a standard model and call it a day. So it developed something called constitutional AI, a training method where the model checks its own outputs against an explicit, written set of principles. The goal was a model that was helpful, but also honest about what it didn't know, and reluctant to flatter the user just to seem agreeable. That mattered, because some of the early consumer chatbots had a habit of agreeing with whatever the user said, or stating falsehoods with total confidence. For a junior associate at a law firm or an engineer reviewing a security patch, that habit isn't a quirk, it's a liability. Claude was built to behave more like a careful colleague than an eager assistant, willing to push back, willing to say, "I'm not sure." Anthropic also resisted the one-size-fits-all consumer playbook. Instead of a single model trying to be everything to everyone, it shipped a tiered family with deliberately understated names. Haiku for fast, lightweight tasks. Sonnet as the dependable everyday workhorse. And Opus for the heaviest reasoning work. It expanded the model's context window dramatically too, eventually up to 1 million tokens for some versions. Enough for a law firm to drop in an entire case file, or an engineering team to feed in a whole codebase in a single prompt. That trajectory eventually produced Claude Code, which broke from the standard AI assistant template entirely. Rather than sitting inside a browser tab or functioning as a glorified autocomplete, it was built to operate directly inside a developer's terminal. Navigating file systems, executing commands, holding context across a project that might span several days. It behaved less like a tool and more like a junior engineer who happened to never sleep. It went on to become one of the fastest growing products in the company's history, scaling into billions of dollars of annualized revenue. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because this is the part that breaks most assumptions about how fast-growing companies are supposed to market themselves. For years, Anthropic ran what might be the leanest marketing operation of any company growing at this speed. At one point, by some accounts, the entire marketing function was effectively run by a single person. There was essentially no paid advertising, no aggressive growth hacking, no funnel optimization team chasing conversion rates. Instead, the company treated the product itself as the message. In enterprise software, this is a distinction worth sitting with. Marketing isn't a layer you apply on top of the product after it ships. It's the lived, day-to-day experience of using it. Every interaction is an advertisement, for better or worse. Consider the visual identity. Before Claude ever launched publicly, Anthropic spent more than 2.5 years working with the design studio Geist to build a look that deliberately rejected everything else in the category. At a moment when competitor after competitor reached for neon gradients, dark mode cyberpunk aesthetics, and cold corporate blues, Anthropic chose warm earth tones, a custom serif typeface, and hand-drawn illustrations to explain technical concepts. That wasn't a styling decision, it was a positioning decision. The visual language said, approachable, human, intellectually serious, precisely the opposite of the move fast and figure it out later energy radiating from its competitors. And it landed at exactly the moment. Risk-averse enterprise buyers were forming their first impressions during procurement reviews. Design, in this case, wasn't decoration. It was strategic infrastructure. The same logic shaped how the brand defined itself internally. Anthropic's brand team settled on 4 voice principles for Claude: intelligent, warm, unvarnished, and collaborative. But instead of printing those words on a billboard, the company worked to encode them into how the model actually behaved. When users discovered that Claude would gently push back on a flawed assumption, admit when it didn't know something, or decline to fabricate an answer just to seem useful, that behavior confirmed the brand's promise in real time. There was no gap between the claim and the experience, and that absence of a gap is precisely what generated organic word-of-mouth inside skeptical developer communities. Communities that don't typically reward marketing claims, but do reward products that actually do what they say. It took until September of 2025 for Anthropic to run its first major brand campaign. Working with the Finzi independent agency mother, it called the platform Keep Thinking. And the campaign is worth pausing on because of what it deliberately avoided. It didn't lean on the dominant tropes of consumer AI advertising, AI as a shortcut, AI as a way to write a lazier email, AI as permission to think less. Instead, it featured engineers, artists, and conservationists using Claude as a thinking partner on problems that were genuinely difficult. The message was simple. This is an amplifier of human intelligence, not a replacement for it. That framing was aimed squarely at a specific kind of customer, the high-retention professional who takes real pride in their work and who doesn't want to be sold convenience. They want to be respected. So what does this story actually teach us about growth? First, positioning needs real stakes behind it. Anthropic's safety. First message was credible because the founders had already paid a price for it, walking away from the most prominent lab in the world, and because the company backed it up with tangible commitments, like not training its models on enterprise customers' data by default. A brand promise that costs the company nothing to make is just a slogan. A brand promise that costs something is a strategy. Second, the delivery is the promise. When a product's actual behavior matches the story being told about it, you need far less advertising to convince anyone of anything. Onboarding flows, edge case handling, support interactions, and default settings. These are marketing channels too, whether a company treats them that way or not. Third, an anti-category aesthetic can become a genuine asset. In a crowded market, copying the visual language of the category leader makes a challenger invisible. Just another version of the same thing. By choosing a warm, editorial, human-centered design in an industry full of machine-like branding, Anthropic forced buyers to mentally file it under a different heading altogether. It wasn't competing for the same shelf space. It built its own shelf. And fourth, sell to the user's highest self, not their laziest impulse. While much of the industry marketed AI as the ultimate convenience, do less, think less, offload more, Anthropic went after people who wanted to do hard things well. That choice tends to produce a more loyal customer base, one willing to weave a product deep into critical, high-stakes workflows rather than treat it as a disposable convenience. Anthropic's path from a tented backyard pitch to an enterprise heavyweight wasn't the product of luck, and it wasn't purely a function of computing power. It came from an unusually tight alignment between what the company built and how it talked, or chose not to talk, about it. It identified a real trust deficit in the market, engineered a product around closing it, wrapped that product in a brand that signaled rigor rather than hype, and then largely got out of the way and let the product speak for itself. The growth figures the company reports are self-described, run rates in a market that is still moving extremely quickly, and Restraint as a strategy will face real pressure as competitors adopt similar language and similar promises. But the underlying lesson holds regardless of how the next chapter unfolds. When a product's behavior is the clearest expression of a company's philosophy, the marketing doesn't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes the most effective marketing is simply the product, quietly behaving exactly as promised. This was the marketing behind rapid growth. See you in the next episode.